They looked like gods, crowned in gold, draped in velvet, immortalized in marble. But behind the portraits and pageantry were twisted spines, fragile minds, failing limbs, and secrets locked behind palace walls. These were monarchs held together by myth, ceremony, and silence. What happens when the body meant to embody a nation begins to fall apart? Welcome to a world where the throne is heavy, the truth is hidden, and the crown doesn't care if it fits. This is 33 royals with hidden disabilities and deformities, and nothing about power is as perfect as it looks. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed if you love unraveling the untold, the uncomfortable, and the strangely human side of history. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid, 3 a.m. in Manila. We want to know who else is wide awake with us, chasing shadows through royal corridors. 1. Tutankhamun. By the time he was crowned pharaoh, the boy wasn't walking. He was wobbling, not with majesty, not with godlike purpose, but with the quiet desperation of someone just trying to stay upright. His legs, twisted by congenital deformities, couldn't support his weight properly. His spine curved where it shouldn't, his left foot was clubbed inwards, and the bones in his body betrayed a pattern of fragility. One knee injury alone would have left him limping. He had several, and yet Tutankhamun, the so-called living image of Amun, was supposed to embody divine perfection, a living god, radiant in strength, masculine beauty, and eternal youth. It's hard to project that when you're leaning on a stick, which is why they gave him over 130 ceremonial canes. Not out of generosity, out of necessity. The court had to mask the fact that the son of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, had inherited not just a theologically unstable kingdom, but a genetically unstable body. Thanks to centuries of royal inbreeding, Tutankhamun wasn't just a boy king. He was a medical mystery wrapped in linen and political spin. His tomb, hastily prepared, shockingly small and accidentally preserved, became a trapdoor into everything the Egyptians never wanted us to know. The golden death mask, flawless and serene, became iconic, but CT scans and forensic reconstructions, done thousands of years later, revealed something else. A frail teenager with a cleft palate, elongated skull, malformed limbs, and possibly a degenerative disease. The god king needed help to walk. He likely limped into every public ceremony, propped up by aides or literally held up by religious theatre. In depictions, he's often shown in chariots, as if to suggest vitality. Ironically, he may not have been able to stand in one without assistance. To die at 19 is tragic. To rule at 9 is absurd. But to be deified while deformed, that takes propaganda. The court artists mastered it. They didn't erase his disabilities, they ritualized them. Paintings and carvings showed Tutankhamun performing hunting scenes, making offerings, and vanquishing enemies. But these were symbolic. He wasn't slaying Nubians in real life, he was surviving daily life, in pain, in ceremony, in silence. Was he aware? Probably. Was he in control? Almost certainly not. His advisors, most notably Ay and Horemheb, orchestrated both his rule and his image. They knew Egypt needed a stabilizing figurehead, not a fragile boy with scoliosis and a clubfoot. So they staged the divine. They wrapped him in gold, they buried him in splendor, and then they moved on. Quickly, it's telling that Tutankhamun's name was nearly erased from history. No grand monuments bore his legacy. No majestic temples commemorated his reign. For the new kingdom elite, he was a transitional inconvenience, useful for continuity, then quietly forgotten. It wasn't until 1922, when Howard Carter cracked open the desert's most dramatic time capsule, that the world remembered the boy in the mask. And even then, they preferred the mask to the boy. But beneath all that gold, there was a crooked body, bent under the weight of expectation, ritual, and bone. And it wasn't unique. because 1 generation earlier, Egypt had already crowned a pharaoh whose body defied symmetry, whose silhouette unsettled tradition, and whose very face was a riddle. His name was Akhenaten, and he made divine deformity part of the state religion. 2. Siptah, the boy who became pharaoh. Siptah stepped onto the throne of Egypt not as a conqueror but as a patient. His reign, short, contested, and riddled with intrigue, was defined less by his policies than by his posture. If Tutankhamun's frailty was hidden behind a gold mask, Siptah's was hidden behind the throne itself. He was no towering warrior king, no living god striding across battlefields. He was a teenager with a twisted foot and a body that refused to play along with the ritual choreography of kingship. Archaeologists didn't need to speculate about Siptah's condition. His mummified remains speak plainly. The left foot is severely deformed, classic signs of clubfoot. The long bones of his leg show uneven growth. He may have limped or perhaps dragged the leg altogether, yet his court still had to sell the illusion of divine perfection. In temple reliefs and official imagery, Siptah stands or sits in poses that erase his asymmetry. His canes, essential tools for mobility, are absent from the scenes. Instead, he's shown wielding the crook and flail of Pharaoh, symbols of shepherding the people, not the supports of a crippled youth. He came to power during one of the most unstable periods of the New Kingdom. Egypt was recovering from the religious and political turmoil left by Akhenaten's heresy and Tutankhamun's fragile reign. Behind the scenes, the power lay with others, the influential Chancellor Bey and later the regent Tausret. They were the ones moving armies and signing decrees, while Siptah served as a living seal of legitimacy. His condition made him even more useful in some ways. A malleable boy king whose presence projected continuity, even as his actual governance was conducted by stronger hands. But the physical toll must have been immense. Public ceremonies in Thebes or Memphis were not short affairs. They demanded long processions, standing before crowds, kneeling at altars. For a boy with a clubfoot, this wasn't just uncomfortable. It was agony dressed up as ritual. His caretakers and handlers had to choreograph every movement to minimize visible weakness. Perhaps that's why his reign feels so ghost-like in the historical record. He's present, but only as a silhouette, a name in cartouches, a face on statues whose feet we're not supposed to notice. Siptah's burial tells its own story. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings was unfinished at his death. The decoration, sparse and hurried, suggests a ruler who wasn't expected to die so soon, or wasn't expected to matter much after death. Yet the bones don't lie. They record a life shaped by congenital deformity, layered atop political manipulation, all wrapped in the pretense of divine health. If Tutankhamun's body was a puzzle solved by CT scans, Siptah's is a footnote in the same saga. A second act in a dynasty of fragile pharaohs whose deformities had to be hidden behind the smoke and mirrors of royal iconography. And then, just as the court began perfecting the art of concealing fragility, Egypt crowned a ruler whose very body became a theological experiment, a living contradiction sculpted into stone reliefs. His name was Akhenaten. If you're still with us 2 monarchs in, you're clearly one of the curious ones, the kind who reads between the portraits. So make sure to subscribe for more stories that history textbooks politely skip, and let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Are you walking through rain-soaked streets, or lying in bed, earbuds in, palace doors creaking open in your mind? 3. Akhenaten. You could say Akhenaten broke the mold, but it would be more accurate to say he melted it down, re-sculpted it with bizarre proportions, then declared it sacred. The 14th century BCE pharaoh, born Amenhotep IV, didn't just invent a new religion. He invented a new body, his own. And whether his famously androgynous, elongated form was the result of a genetic disorder Ritual stylization or deliberate propaganda remains one of Egyptology's most elegant unsolved puzzles. His statues are startling, not in the way kings are supposed to be, muscular, broad-shouldered, eternally young, but in the way you pause when something in a painting doesn't quite add up. Akhenaten's face is long, his lips exaggerated, his belly protruding. His hips are wide, thighs thick, chest almost feminine. At Karnak and Amarna, walls teem with images of this pharaoh in poses no ruler had dared strike before, cradling his children, leaning tenderly against his wife, or basking beneath the sun disk, the Aten, whose rays end in human hands caressing his face. His body defies the template, it invites scrutiny. Some have speculated he suffered from a connective tissue disorder, Marfan syndrome perhaps, or Klinefelter's. Others suspect endocrine abnormalities, but the evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. His mummy has never been definitively identified, and most of what we think we know is based on art, which makes everything more complicated. Was Akhenaten truly deformed, or did he choose to appear that way? Here's where the mystery deepens. His entire religious revolution centered around a single god, the Aten, the sun disk, and in this new theology, Akhenaten was not just the chosen mouthpiece of the divine, he was the only intermediary between God and man. The court art may not have been documentary, it may have been liturgical. His unusual body might not have been a medical fact, but a religious metaphor. Otherworldly, liminal, unique, a fusion of male and female, mortal and divine. The image of a god who didn't resemble anything familiar, but not everyone was convinced. Akhenaten's reforms alienated the powerful priesthood of Amun. The temples were stripped, the old gods erased, the capital moved to a brand new city built from scratch, Amarna. His vision was sweeping, but his enemies were patient. After his death, the backlash came swiftly. His name was chiseled out of inscriptions, his city abandoned, his memory condemned, and yet his imagery survived as mutilated but not erased. Even in disgrace, Akhenaten couldn't be made to disappear completely. The body he presented to the world, ambiguous, uncanny, possibly deformed, refused to be forgotten. If he was disabled, he made it divine. If he wasn't, he invented a disability to make his body unreadable, unplaceable, outside the reach of human categories. He was a mystery in life, a scandal in death, and a riddle ever since. But in trying to make the divine more human, he may have inadvertently made himself more vulnerable, because when the facade slips, when the ceremonial body starts to look too real, too fallible, too strange, the illusion of control begins to collapse. Which brings us to a king who never got that illusion to begin with. He ruled with an open wound, one the court could hide only for so long. A boy crowned with a wasting disease, ruling in a land where miracles were expected, and where lepers were meant to be kept outside the gates. 4. Baldwin IV, the leper. There are worse things than dying young. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem did something more complicated. He ruled, he reigned while dying, slowly, visibly, in front of the entire Christian world. Crowned at 13, dead by 24, Baldwin became known to history by the only title that seemed to stick, the Leper King. But that nickname tells only part of the story. What's more remarkable isn't that he had Hansen's disease. It's that for nearly a decade he held on to a kingdom with nothing but nerves, strategy, and the sheer force of court choreography. Baldwin's illness was noticed early, not by physicians, but by a palace tutor. The young prince could not feel pain in his right arm during rough games. At first, this seemed like a blessing. It wasn't. Leprosy was and is a slow thief of the body. Sensation vanishes, skin numbs, joints disfigure, the face changes. But Baldwin's mind remained razor sharp, and that made him useful, because Jerusalem, at the heart of the Crusader states, needed not just a monarch but a symbol, and Baldwin, despite his illness, became that symbol. The royal court, aware of the disease's stigma, began a complex and deliberate campaign of controlled appearances. When he could still ride, he did so in public processions. When the disease advanced, he appeared on a litter surrounded by loyal nobles. His robes were layered, his gloves thick, his face, increasingly disfigured, was obscured beneath veils or helmets. And behind that spectacle, realpolitik bloomed. Baldwin kept warlords and schemers in check, negotiated with Saladin, and forestalled collapse through pure mental force. His sickness, ironically, gave him leverage. No one expected longevity. Everyone vied for position in a future they assumed would arrive swiftly. Baldwin used this to his advantage, pitting factions against each other, promising regencies, rearranging successions. It was Machiavellian, if Machiavelli had written with incense and parchment. By his final year, he was a shadow. He could not walk, his hands were curled, his voice was weak, but still he ruled, through regents, proxies, and legal fictions, yes. But Baldwin was the axis. As long as he lived, the kingdom held. The court dressed up every royal outing as a miracle, every appearance as divine perseverance. There was even a certain cultic awe to him, a king touched by affliction, standing as guardian of the holy city, even as his own flesh betrayed him. When he died, the kingdom unraveled, not immediately, but inevitably. The fracturing began. Saladin would soon sweep in, but Baldwin's reign remains a paradox, a crippled king who held his throne not despite his illness, but because he mastered its optics. And yet, for all the political maneuvering and ritual stagecraft, Baldwin's affliction was too physical to fully mask. The court did what they could. They veiled, they spun, they arranged, but they couldn't hide shaking hand or a faltering step. Which brings us to a man the Romans tried to hide entirely, a stammering, limping, half-forgotten figure, buried in the family line until history and death pulled him reluctantly into the spotlight. His name was Claudius, and he was not supposed to be emperor. 5. Emperor Claudius. In Rome, deformity was either comic or tragic, rarely imperial. The line between dignity and disgrace ran straight through the public gaze, and for most of his life, Claudius lived in the shadows of both. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 10 BCE, he had the bloodline of an emperor, but none of the grooming. He stuttered, he limped, he drooled, his head twitched, his knees wobbled, and when he spoke, the words came halting and strange. In a society obsessed with symmetry, rhetoric, and martial bearing, Claudius seemed, at best, an embarrassment, at worst, a cautionary tale, so they hid him. Historians describe how the imperial family kept Claudius away from public duties, public eyes, and public danger. He wasn't allowed to speak in the Senate. His name was left off official succession plans. Statues of him were rare and unflattering. His own mother reportedly referred to him as a monstrosity of a man, begun but never finished. He became the butt of palace jokes, the harmless fool, the stammering uncle, safe to keep around because no one took him seriously, which was exactly how he survived. Because while his relatives were busy being assassinated, exiled, or declared enemies of the state, Claudius was considered too laughable to threaten anyone. He became a scholar. He read history, wrote volumes, and observed the chaos around him. Then, in 41 CE, chaos crowned him. After the assassination of Caligula, his nephew, Claudius was reportedly found hiding behind a curtain, terrified. The Praetorian Guard dragged him out, and for lack of any better alternative, declared him emperor. The Senate was stunned. Rome braced for disaster. Instead, Claudius ruled for 13 years, and he ruled well. Despite his physical impairments, or perhaps because of them, Claudius approached power methodically. He reformed the judiciary, expanded the empire into Britain, and increased infrastructure development across the provinces. He also married poorly, trusted slaves over senators, and wrote more history than politics would allow. But he governed with competence. His impairments, once mocked, became irrelevant in the face of results. Still, the court image makers had their work cut out for them. Portraits of Claudius tried to reconcile the reality with the ideal. His statues feature the typical Roman muscular chest and serene expression, standard issue for the imperial cult, but there's always something slightly off: a too long neck, a softness in the features, a vacancy in the eyes. It was as if the artists knew they could sculpt power but not conceal its awkwardness entirely. Even in Suetonius's gossip-laced biography, Claudius appears as a walking contradiction, grotesque but sharp, mocked but effective. His disabilities were never completely hidden, just reframed. The joke, as it turned out, was on everyone else. The stammering uncle behind the curtain became the only adult in a dynasty of flaming wreckage. But disability, however well managed, leaves a mark. And in Claudius's case, it was a mark Rome could never quite scrub from its memory. He proved that deformity didn't disqualify. But that didn't stop the empire from trying to pretend it never existed in the first place. Which takes us to a different kind of spectacle. A monarch whose mind fractured in public, whose reign unravelled under the weight of voices no one else could hear, and whose court tried desperately to stitch together the tatters of sanity with ritual, ceremony, and silence. Charles VI of France wasn't just mad, he was crowned that way. 6. Charles VI, the Mad. France crowned Charles VI in gold, but it lost him to glass. He was just 11 when his father died, just 20 when the psychotic breaks began, and by the end of his reign, Charles VI, once called the Beloved, had earned a darker title, Le Fou, the Mad. But madness in the medieval court wasn't just a medical issue, it was a theological riddle, a dynastic threat, and a PR nightmare. So for decades, the French monarchy played a delicate game, conceal what they could, compensate where they had to, and cling desperately to the rituals of kingship, even as the man inside the robes ceased to function. His illness wasn't subtle. The first major episode came in 1392. Riding with his army through a forest, Charles suddenly turned on his own men, killing one, injuring others, then collapsing into catatonia. From that point on, his mental state unravelled in unpredictable cycles. He had periods of clarity, enough to confuse his courtiers into false hope, followed by long spells of delusion. He forgot his name, he forgot he was king. At times, he forgot he had a body at all. In one infamous episode, Charles believed he was made of glass. He insisted on wearing padded clothing to avoid shattering. He banned people from touching him. In other moments, he howled like an animal, or claimed he was St. George, or failed to recognize his wife and children. But unlike a fallen general or a disfigured soldier, Charles couldn't retreat from the spotlight. His body was the cornerstone of legitimacy, so his handlers, and there were many, had to manufacture the illusion of a functioning monarch. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, became the de facto regent. The king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, and later the Duke of Burgundy, took over governance and feuded bitterly for the privilege. Councils met in the king's name, edicts were issued from the royal chamber, and on occasion Charles was paraded before the court in splendid robes, quiet and passive, nodding when prompted, smiling for ceremony. It didn't matter that he had no idea where he was. What mattered was that he was physically present, visibly regal, symbolically intact. But symbols don't stop civil war. As Charles's episodes grew more severe, the realm fractured. The 100 Years' War resumed with England. The internal power struggle between Orleans and Burgundy spiraled into bloodshed. France became a chessboard of factions, all pretending that the king was still in charge, even as they used his madness to legitimize their own moves. His face still appeared on coins, his likeness still adorned churches, but behind the solemn portraits, Charles VI lived in a twilight state, lucid then lost, revered then pitied. His court clung to rituals like a drowning man to driftwood, hoping that enough pageantry could substitute for power. It couldn't, and yet Charles's body, fragile mind and all, remained the anchor of legitimacy. The mere fact of his kingship forced the machinery of state to grind on, even as reality slipped away. Because if the king could go mad and still be king, then maybe the idea of monarchy was bigger than the man himself. That illusion, that separation between body and symbol, would be tested again, not in France this time, but across the Channel, where a king with a crooked spine would face the mirror, the court, and the battlefield, and be forced to ask what makes a ruler look like one at all. 7. Richard III. Richard III has always had a branding problem. History remembers him as the crook-backed villain of the English throne, all ambition, no scruples, hunched in shadow and dragging a misshapen spine through the corridors of power. Shakespeare made him famous. A skeleton under a Leicester parking lot made him real. And in between those two versions, the theatrical monster and the archaeological man, lies a portrait of royal deformity too inconvenient to forget and too useful to resist rewriting. Born in 1452 into the turbulent House of York, Richard wasn't initially expected to rule. He was the 11th child. His older brother, Edward IV, took the crown by conquest. Richard became a loyal lieutenant, fierce, politically sharp, and, by many accounts, physically competent, until he wasn't. When he seized the crown in 1483, declaring his nephews illegitimate and locking them in the Tower of London, Richard made the leap from brother to monarch, and from loyalist to villain. Almost instantly, the chroniclers turned on his body. Rumours of a hunched back began to circulate. He was called deformed, twisted, evil in bone as well as mind. And when Shakespeare came along a century later, Richard was immortalized as a bitter hunchback who justified tyranny with physical grotesquerie. But there's a twist. It wasn't all fiction. In 2012, the discovery and analysis of Richard's skeletal remains confirmed a severe case of adolescent-onset scoliosis. His spine curved sharply to the right, enough to cause visible asymmetry in life, though likely not the full-bodied contortion suggested by centuries of dramatists. He wasn't a monstrous hunchback, but he was crooked, in posture if not in soul. And the royal court, they worked around it. His armour was custom-fitted, his tailoring carefully cut. His portraits, though painted after his death, show an upright figure with no signs of deformity. The illusion of straightness was maintained through sheer effort, symbolic symmetry imposed upon a body that refused to comply. The irony is that Richard's brief reign wasn't particularly monstrous by the standards of the Wars of the Roses. His legal reforms were forward-thinking. His death at Bosworth Field was brutal, but not uncommon. Yet his body, or rather how it was framed, outlived all his policies. In the end, his disability was not what made him infamous. It was how others used it. His twisted spine became the metaphor everyone needed, proof of a twisted mind, a natural sign of political illegitimacy. But what happens when the body can't be hidden? When no amount of posture or portraiture can obscure the genetic bill that centuries of royal inbreeding finally come to collect? Enter Charles II of Spain, a monarch so profoundly shaped by generations of dynastic self-pairing that his reign became a living catalogue of hereditary collapse. 8. Charles II of Spain. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But curses, convenient as they are in the royal imagination, don't explain everything. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661 into a bloodline so tangled with itself that nature simply stopped cooperating. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles inherited not just a throne, but a collapsing genetic empire. His jaw didn't close, his tongue barely fit in his mouth, his body was frail, his intellect underdeveloped, and his reign long, too long. He lived to 40. But the question wasn't how long he lived, it was how. The court worked tirelessly to uphold the illusion of strength. Portraits by the great Spanish painters idealized him. His massive lower jaw, the infamous Habsburg prognathism, was softened in oil and shadow. The swollen tongue that mangled his speech was never depicted. His slow comprehension, his infertility, his inability to eat properly, all were carefully managed behind layers of etiquette, costume, and absolute protocol. Ceremony became his armor. He was rarely alone. His days were scripted. Ministers made decisions in his name. Physicians debated his ailments in whispers. Religious advisors proposed exorcisms. Diplomats described him with unease, as childlike, dependent, and more dead than alive. Yet still the machinery of monarchy dragged on, powered by ritual and inertia. Behind it all loomed the dread of succession. Charles had no children. He could not produce them. The line would end with him, and everyone knew it. Europe waited like vultures, carving up his future estate before he'd even lost his grip on it. Meanwhile, the Spanish court staged a living spectacle of kingship. Charles, in velvet and brocade, sitting stiffly beneath a canopy, nodding when required, mouthing ceremonial Latin with effort. A body transformed into a symbol, a man turned into a question mark. The cause of his condition wasn't a mystery. The Habsburgs had intermarried for centuries. Their family tree was more of a wreath. Charles's genes bore the cost. He was not a cursed man. He was a statistical inevitability. Yet, for all his failings, Charles II ruled longer than many healthier men. That in itself disturbed the narrative. He should have been a footnote, brief, pitiable, forgettable, but the spectacle of his suffering reigned for decades, unnerving everyone who saw him. The court couldn't fix him. They could only curate him. And when he finally died, it was less an end than a detonation. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a Europe-wide crisis. The body had failed, but the crown somehow still mattered, just as it did in Vienna, where a very different Charles, born centuries later across a much colder empire, faced his own challenges. His mind was sharp, his intentions were good, but when the seizures began, the crown had to improvise. 9. Ferdinand IV of Austria. It's never a good sign when your coronation speech becomes a punchline. Ferdinand IV of Austria, crowned Emperor of Austria in 1835, was not known for his eloquence. His first official act upon being declared ruler was reportedly to stammer out a confused protest. "But I must have the dumplings." The moment, repeated in imperial gossip circles with all the subtlety of court satire, captured a deeper truth the Habsburgs were reluctant to admit. Ferdinand wasn't built for kingship, and yet he ruled, or rather he reigned, while the empire ruled itself around him. Born in 1793 to Emperor Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, Ferdinand was the unfortunate product of what Habsburgs did best: marrying each other. The result was a complex suite of medical and neurological issues. He suffered from frequent, violent epileptic seizures, over 20 in a single day, according to some records. His speech was impaired. He had trouble processing information, struggled with decision-making, and relied heavily on caretakers throughout his life. The court, faced with a young man who physically resembled an emperor but couldn't function like one, turned to choreography. His public appearances were limited, staged, and carefully managed. He wore ornate uniforms, nodded through ceremonies, and signed documents placed before him by others. His signature was a formality. Power resided elsewhere. That power came in the form of a shadow government led by Prince Metternich, the formidable Chancellor of Austria, and a council of regents. The Habsburg bureaucracy became a well-oiled machine of governance without genuine monarchical input. Ferdinand was present but ornamental. The idea of monarchy endured, but its machinery adapted. Privately, Ferdinand was described as kind and good-natured, a man who loved gardening, music, and indeed dumplings. He was not cruel, nor ambitious, nor egotistical. He simply wasn't made for empire. His seizures made public appearances risky. His comprehension lagged behind the speed of statecraft, and yet the empire clung to him, not for his leadership, but for the continuity of lineage. The 1848 revolutions changed everything. Facing massive unrest and pressure from liberal movements, the court finally acted. Metternich resigned. Ferdinand abdicated, gently, quietly, under the pretext of illness, and passed the throne to his young nephew, Franz Joseph. It was a peaceful exit, a rare thing in a stormy age. Ferdinand retired to Prague, where he lived out his days, surrounded by books, gardens, and serenity. And yet, his reign remains a curious chapter. Not quite a tragedy, not quite farce. An empire run by regents and ruled by a man too gentle and too impaired to grasp its weight. Which brings us to another monarch whose mind slipped in and out of reality, not from birth, but from collapse. A king of England, whose mental breaks turned into national crises, and whose quiet spells of catatonia left a continent wondering who's really in charge when the king is not entirely there. 10. Henry VI of England. If kingship is about command, Henry VI of England was born into the wrong job. Crowned before his first birthday, orphaned by his 9th year, and plagued by bouts of mental collapse that would paralyze his court, Henry reigned not like a lion, but like a shadow, flickering in and out of his own narrative. He wasn't untalented, he was simply unprepared. His early reign, during one of England's most turbulent stretches, was marked by peace treaties that failed, noble feuds that festered, and a king more inclined toward theology than strategy. But his greatest challenge wasn't political, it was neurological. In 1453, after years of mounting tensions and military setbacks, Henry fell into what his contemporaries delicately called a trance. For over a year, he did not speak, did not respond, did not move without assistance. He failed to recognize his own newborn son. Ministers whispered, nobles circled, governance froze. In modern terms, historians have speculated everything from schizophrenia spectrum disorders to catatonic depression. Whatever the exact cause, the consequences were undeniable. The machinery of monarchy had to keep spinning, even if the man wearing the crown couldn't turn the gears. Enter the Regency. Parliament installed Richard, Duke of York, as protector of the realm. A decision that may have been politically necessary but personally catastrophic. When Henry recovered his senses in 1455, he returned to a kingdom he barely recognized, controlled by factions that no longer trusted him. And so began the long, slow spiral into the Wars of the Roses. Throughout his reign, Henry oscillated between brief periods of clarity and long silences. Each relapse chipped away at his authority. Each recovery arrived too late. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, took an increasingly active role in court politics, while noble houses prepared for civil war. Even when Henry was lucid, he was weak, and when he wasn't, he was effectively absent. And still, the throne required his presence. The court staged ceremonies, issued proclamations, and paraded a monarch who no longer had the cognitive command of his office. Like Ferdinand of Austria, Henry became a symbol sustained by ritual. But unlike Ferdinand, whose quiet exit preserved peace, Henry's frailty helped detonate a dynastic war. The crown needed more than a body in a robe. It needed presence, and sometimes presence wasn't possible. But what if the king had a body that looked strong, but simply didn't work that way? A ruler whose condition wasn't in his mind, but in his limbs, paralyzed on one side, crowned nonetheless, and carefully posed for a kingdom that preferred not to notice. 11. Afonso VI of Portugal. In 17th century Portugal, power wasn't simply worn, it was performed. The robes, the scepter, the solemn procession through Lisbon's narrow streets, all of it crafted the illusion that the monarch was not merely a man, but a nation embodied. So what happens when the body refuses to cooperate with the performance? Afonso VI was born into victory. His father, John IV, had just restored Portugal's independence from Spain after decades of Habsburg rule. Afonso, second son turned heir after his older brother's death, was the poster child of dynastic renewal. But the real story was less triumphant. Around age 3, Afonso suffered a mysterious illness, possibly meningitis or a severe infection, that left him with partial paralysis on his left side and ongoing cognitive impairments. From that point forward, the court was forced into a long, awkward negotiation, how to make a half-paralyzed, developmentally delayed boy look like a warrior king. The answer was choreography, delegation, and denial. Afonso could not walk with a typical gait. He had difficulty coordinating movement and suffered from erratic behavior, but official portraits depicted him with poise, balance, and gravitas. Public appearances were limited and tightly scripted. He sat more than he stood. When he did walk, he was supported by canes, by handlers, by ceremony itself. His physical condition was never formally acknowledged. In state matters, the illusion of control had to outweigh the reality of dependence. For a time, it worked. When he became king in 1656, he was still a minor, and power was wielded by his mother, Luisa de Guzman, who acted as regent with strategic poise. But once Afonso came of age, things unraveled. He attempted to assert himself. Ministers defected, the court split, his behavior became more erratic, his judgment more suspect. By 1667, just 11 years into his reign, a palace coup led by his own younger brother Pedro quietly removed him from power. And yet, Afonso was not deposed, not officially. He remained king in name, appearing at select ceremonies, seated under heavy brocade, flanked by advisors. Pedro ruled as Prince Regent, issuing decrees on behalf of the king. It was a royal theatre of the highest order, the crown intact, the mind behind it sidelined. Even Afonso's marriage was symbolic. His wife, Marie-Françoise of Savoy, sought an annulment on grounds of non-consummation. Her second husband, Pedro, Afonso's brother and regent. The substitution was seamless, legally, politically, visually. The monarchy marched on, with the pageantry unchanged and the players rearranged. Afonso died in 1683, quietly and mostly forgotten. Portugal had, for all practical purposes, moved on, but his reign remains a study in the limits of royal image-making, how far a throne can carry a man who cannot carry himself. And yet, centuries earlier, another monarch faced a different kind of challenge. He wasn't weak in mind or body. He was blind, totally. But blindness, in the age of chivalry, was not disqualifying. Not if you had enough armor, enough handlers, and enough myth. His name was John of Bohemia. 12. John Mamai of Bohemia. If you had walked into the court of Luxembourg in the 14th century, you might not have noticed anything unusual about King John of Bohemia at first. He was tall, imposing, and rode with the practiced confidence of a seasoned warrior. But by the end of his reign, John fought his battles without seeing them. Not metaphorically, literally. He was blind in both eyes, and yet somehow still dying on horseback in the heart of a melee. Born in 1296, John was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Henry VII. He became King of Bohemia at just 14, ruling over a kingdom that was wealthy, strategically important, and extremely volatile. He was multilingual, charismatic, and endlessly restless. In fact, he spent so much time abroad campaigning, adventuring, and politicking across Europe that his own subjects nicknamed him the Foreign King. But John didn't care. He wasn't in it for domestic policy. He was in it for glory. His decline in vision began in middle age. Records suggest it was caused by ophthalmia, a chronic inflammation that worsened with time. By the 1340s, he was completely blind, but stepping down, not an option. Chivalric culture didn't leave much room for kings who retired. Instead, John doubled down on pageantry. He surrounded himself with loyal knights, trained attendants to guide him, and perfected a persona that made blindness part of his legend. And he leaned into it. He would ride into jousts accompanied by aides who whispered in his ear. At state functions, he appeared in full armor, his blindness cloaked beneath layers of spectacle. The court treated his condition not as a weakness, but as mystique, the warrior king whose sight was gone, but whose sword was still sharp. The final proof of that myth came at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. John was 60, completely blind, and technically not obligated to fight. The French and Bohemian forces were facing the English longbow in one of the 100 Years' War's decisive moments. As the battle turned against the French, John insisted on riding into combat. His knights tied their horses together so he could charge with them, formation style, into the English line. It was a suicide mission, but it was also legend-making. John died in the charge, hacked down alongside his men. The English reportedly found his body still in the saddle, armor intact, his crest, a pair of ostrich feathers, and the motto, "Ich dien," I serve, would later be adopted by the Prince of Wales. Blindness never stopped John from acting like a king. In fact, it may have amplified his legacy. He became a symbol of chivalric defiance, remembered not for his policies, but for the sheer audacity of pretending that vision was optional for greatness. But not every monarch could so easily reframe their body into a myth. Some had to mask their struggles beneath layers of powder and protocol, disguising pain as pageantry and letting disability rot quietly behind the throne. Such monarch was Queen Anne of Great Britain. 13. Queen Anne. If monarchy is built on image, Queen Anne ruled from within a portrait frame, one layered in silk, powdered in white, and thick with illusion. From a distance, she was regal. Up close, she was in pain. Gout, obesity, and chronic illness plagued her reign, turning every step into an ordeal, every ceremony into a trial of endurance. Yet the throne of Great Britain had no off switch, no sick leave policy, and no room for visible fragility. So the court concealed what they could and compensated for what they couldn't. Born in 1665, Anne was the second daughter of James II, a Stuart princess caught in the Protestant Catholic tensions that defined English politics. Her rise to the throne in 1702 followed a rocky path. The Glorious Revolution, her sister Mary's reign alongside William III, and the quiet sidelining of her own father. But by the time she was crowned queen in her own right, Anne was already dealing with a body that refused to cooperate. She suffered from a form of inflammatory arthritis, almost certainly gout, which worsened with age. The pain became so severe that walking was often impossible. She was frequently confined to her chambers, moved in a sedan chair, or wheeled in early versions of a wheelchair. By the later years of her reign, even standing unassisted became a matter of great difficulty. And yet, the show went on. Public appearances were heavily stage-managed. Anne would be lifted into thrones with carved armrests, supported by attendants in carefully choreographed movements. Her garments, always rich, always imposing, were designed not just for elegance, but for concealment. Swollen joints and mobility aids were hidden beneath layers of brocade. Even her portraits were tailored to flatter, regal posture, glowing complexion, royal detachment. None of it showed the reality of the woman behind the crown. But the physical strain was only one part of her story. Anne endured 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in a surviving heir. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and the early deaths of children left her isolated, emotionally battered, and politically vulnerable. Her court, always alert to any sign of weakness, grew tense with factions. The Marlboroughs, the Churchills, the emerging Whigs and Tories, all projecting their agendas through the silhouette of a queen in pain. And yet, Anne remained formidable in her own quiet way. She presided over the Act of Union in 1707, which merged England and Scotland into Great Britain. She navigated court intrigues with surprising cunning, using personal relationships, particularly with Sarah Churchill and Abigail Masham, as political levers. Her decisions were often subtle, sometimes indecisive, but never entirely powerless. Still, the image of Anne was managed like glassware. Every portrait, every ceremony, every moment in public life had to reinforce a lie: that the monarch was physically whole, emotionally unshaken, and endlessly able. Private, she wept. In public, she waved. But not every monarch could hide behind powder and fabric. Some had to construct their image around injuries that left marks too obvious to ignore, scars that disrupted not just posture but poise. The next in line, Elizabeth I, took the art of concealment to theatrical extremes, turning cosmetic deception into royal doctrine. 14. Elizabeth. The face that launched an empire was, by the end, mostly an illusion. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the Renaissance monarch par excellence, understood from an early age that image was her most powerful currency. But beneath the alabaster paint, the towering wigs, and the carefully choreographed portraits, there lived a woman shaped by illness, injury, and the relentless erosion of time. Born in 1533 into the brutal chaos of the Tudor court, Elizabeth grew up with the scars of survival. Her mother executed, her sister imprisoned her, her legitimacy questioned. But it was disease that first threatened to unravel the Queen's carefully managed facade. In 1562, Elizabeth contracted smallpox, a disease that left her severely ill and, despite her recovery, permanently marked. Reports vary on the extent, but it's widely accepted that she bore visible facial scarring, particularly around the mouth and cheeks. For a queen whose legitimacy was already contested and whose authority had to appear untouchable, visible imperfections were unacceptable. Thus began the reign of the mask. Elizabeth adopted heavy white lead-based makeup to cover her scars, a choice that, ironically, may have worsened her health over time. The thick layers of Venetian ceruse gave her the ghostly pallor we now associate with her image, but they were as toxic as they were theatrical. Still, she persisted. Appearance mattered more than comfort. The court played along. In addition to the facial damage, Elizabeth suffered from hair loss and severe dental problems later in life: missing teeth, receding gums, and difficulty speaking clearly. But none of this was permitted to intrude upon the iconography. Wigs replaced hair, gloves concealed aging hands. Public speeches were memorized and rehearsed, often delivered behind screens or from elevated platforms where distance disguised decline. And through all of it, the court maintained the myth. Painters produced increasingly idealized portraits, some based on templates rather than sittings. One, known as the Mask of Youth, was used repeatedly, even when Elizabeth was well into her 60s. The illusion was national policy. To see the Queen age was to admit the crown could fade. Privately, she was known to rage against mirrors. Her courtiers were forbidden to speak of her ailments. She removed herself from court for extended periods, emerging only when the stage was set and the lighting favorable. But she wielded this artifice with masterful precision. Elizabeth didn't just conceal her physical decline, she weaponized her image. Her virginity became a symbol of purity and sovereignty. Her pale face became divine iconography. Her fragility was never admitted, even as her body betrayed her more each year. And yet, behind the cosmetics and control was a woman whose survival depended on not appearing weak. Because in the brutal math of royal politics, even a slight cough could trigger conspiracies. Even a scar could signify vulnerability. Her successor, William III, would inherit more than just her throne. He'd inherit the same struggle: to stand tall when the body wants to collapse, to breathe steadily when the lungs refuse, and to make disability disappear beneath a powdered wig and a polished boot heel. 15. William III, William III of England was not born to look kingly, and he never particularly tried to. Where others cultivated grandeur, he cultivated endurance. Thin, sharp-featured, and perpetually pale, he moved through the court like a man pursued by his own lungs, which, in a sense, he was. His health was fragile, his breathing laboured, and his spine, many suspect, subtly curved. But in an age that demanded divine presence in every royal gesture, William offered something else. A ruler too sick to be theatrical and too competent to be dismissed. Born in 1650 into the House of Orange, William of Orange became Prince of the Netherlands, a Protestant champion, and eventually, through invitation and invasion, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. His 1688 arrival in England, the so-called Glorious Revolution, was less a dramatic conquest than a cold political calculation, and William was nothing if not calculated. Behind the chilly demeanour and formal stiffness was a man whose body gave him daily reminders of its limitations. William suffered from severe asthma, well documented by both his physicians and his courtiers. His breathing was often shallow, laboured, and interrupted by fits of coughing. Damp weather, cold air, and even emotional strain could bring on attacks. London's polluted winters did him no favours. He was said to keep his rooms heated far beyond normal comfort, and often travelled with his own bedding to avoid chills. Despite this, he insisted on maintaining a full schedule of councils, correspondence, and military campaigns. Compounding this was a probable spinal curvature, subtle but present. Contemporary observers remarked on his posture and gait, noting that he appeared hunched or drawn inward. Though never officially diagnosed, many modern historians suspect kyphosis or scoliosis. His portraits often depict him standing stiffly or seated rigidly, his robes arranged to create symmetry. Elevated heels and tall wigs helped him project stature, but it was all costume, political theatre tailored to mask fragility. His court adapted. Ceremonial routines were adjusted to limit physical strain. Public appearances were kept short. His speeches, though formal, were often brief and restrained, conserving breath, yet none of this impaired his authority. William was deeply respected by his allies, feared by his enemies, and tolerated by the English, which, given the political climate, was an achievement in itself. Ironically, it was his physical distance, the remoteness enforced by his health, that added to his mystique. He wasn't the warm paternal monarch some desired. He was a soldier king who outlived expectations, maneuvered past obstacles, and outlasted revolutions. A man whose image had to be managed carefully because his body would never do the job on its own. But physical fragility didn't make William a poor ruler. If anything, it made him more focused, less emotional, more disciplined. Which was good, because the next monarch on our list ruled with a limp, not just of body, but of spirit. And unlike William, she didn't have the advantage of cool detachment. Christina of Sweden ruled with fire, and it nearly burned her court to the ground. 16. Christina of Sweden. Christina of Sweden never quite fit the mould. Not politically, not personally, and certainly not physically. She was crowned in 1650. An 18-year-old woman with the confidence of a seasoned diplomat and the body of someone already nursing old injuries. History remembers her as eccentric, brilliant, erratic, a queen who abdicated her throne, converted religions, and became a self-made legend in a world not quite sure what to do with her. But behind all the philosophy and pageantry was a woman whose health shaped much more than her reputation. Born in 1626 to Gustavus Adolphus, the celebrated Lion of the North, Christina was raised in a court expecting greatness. Her father died in battle when she was just 6, and from that moment, Christina was groomed to rule. But her childhood was marked by illness and injury. Contemporary accounts describe a fall in her early years that injured her hip, perhaps permanently. Later in life, she walked with a pronounced limp, favouring one leg and sometimes using a cane. Her spine, some speculated, was also affected, causing persistent discomfort and an awkward gait. But this was not a court inclined to pity. Sweden's court during the 30 Years' War demanded stoicism. So Christina compensated with intellect, charisma, and theatre. She surrounded herself with scholars, theologians, artists. She spoke Latin, wrote philosophy, and sparred with Descartes. Her court was a blur of intellectual salon and political chessboard, and she, hobbling through palaces in custom-fitted boots and dramatic robes, became its axis. Her clothing was famously unconventional. She often dressed in male-coded attire, doublets, breeches, riding coats. Some of this was personal preference. Some of it was practical. Loose trousers and boots better accommodated her chronic hip and back pain. Portraits carefully downplayed her asymmetry. The Queen was framed as dynamic, angular, mysterious, not limping. Still, the strain showed. Long sessions of court business wore her down. Processions had to be shortened. Her physical discomfort often manifested as emotional volatility. Ministers complained of mood swings, erratic decisions, sudden shifts in policy. But behind every moment of drama was a body that simply could not keep pace with the image of tireless royalty. In 1654, just 4 years after her coronation, Christina abdicated, officially for religious reasons, unofficially for reasons no one could quite agree on. She fled Sweden, converted to Catholicism, and wandered Europe as a former queen turned cultural enigma. Her health, already tenuous, continued to decline, though she maintained her wit and presence until the end. Christina's story isn't just about rebellion or intellectual flair. It's about what happens when the royal body refuses to cooperate, and the royal mind insists on ruling anyway. And in her wake came a king who could not hide behind wit or rebellion, a monarch whose very face betrayed his inheritance and whose jaw became both his burden and his dynasty's signature. 17. Philip IV of Spain. To understand Philip IV of Spain is to understand a portrait, not just any portrait, but dozens, painted by the brilliant and ever-loyal Diego Velázquez. These weren't just depictions of a man, they were visual negotiations between reality and ritual, between the face Philip actually had and the face the Habsburg dynasty needed him to wear. And that face, it was a problem. Philip IV, who ruled from 1621 to 1665, inherited more than an empire. He inherited the infamous Habsburg jaw, prognathism, the medical term, a jutting lower jaw that gave his mouth a permanent droop, distorted his speech, and made even simple eating difficult. It was the genetic echo of generations of royal inbreeding, rendered unmistakably on the face of a man expected to embody divine composure. But in Velázquez's hands, the jawline softened, the eyes deepened, the posture straightened. The result was a king who looked tired, yes, melancholic even, but not disfigured. Behind the brushstrokes, though, was a different reality. Philip's facial structure wasn't just aesthetics, it affected functionality. His speech was often unclear, and his physical presence lacked the commanding authority his title demanded. Courtiers had to adjust to this, leaning in to catch his words, filtering his intentions through intermediaries, masking his occasional physical awkwardness with layers of formality and ritual. The grandeur of the Spanish court, already baroque in its protocol, became even more so because spectacle could distract from biology. And yet, Philip was no fool. He was deeply aware of his own image, both artistically and politically. He commissioned countless portraits not just of himself but of his family, reinforcing the dynasty even as it crumbled internally. He ruled during a period of slow imperial decline, marked by war, economic failure, and political overreach. The Spanish Habsburgs were stretched thin, and Philip, emotionally distant, physically awkward, and increasingly isolated, became a living metaphor for a family and a state losing control of their own narrative. But still, the paintings told a different story. one of nobility, refinement, a controlled decline. The jaw was painted but not emphasized, the awkwardness managed, the mythology intact, and that illusion, so carefully maintained, would be passed on to his son, because if Philip IV lived behind a carefully lit portrait, his heir would become a warning printed into every medical textbook on hereditary collapse. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, had prognathism. Philip IV had prognathism. But the next Charles, Charles II of Spain, would have it, and everything else all at once. But before him came another Charles, far more powerful and equally marked. 18. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. By the time Charles V ruled half of Europe and most of the Americas, his jaw had already become a subject of imperial management. Born in 1500, Charles V was heir to an unprecedented accumulation of titles: King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, and Holy Roman Emperor. He was fluent in diplomacy, obsessed with theology, and perpetually at war, but he also had the jaw, the unmistakable, undeniable Habsburg jaw that would define his portraits and shape his legacy. The mandible jutted forward, the lips struggled to meet, and his mouth was almost always slightly open. Eating and speaking were affected. His face, though noble in structure, bore the unmistakable signature of genetic bottlenecking. But Charles, unlike some of his descendants, didn't flinch from the burden. He embraced ceremony with almost militant rigidity. His portraits, like those painted by Titian, didn't hide the jaw. They dignified it. Here was the face of power, divine favor, imperial destiny. If it looked strange, so be it. It was the face of a man who presided over an empire on which the sun literally never set. Who cared if he couldn't pronounce every word clearly? Still, the court knew what was at stake. The Habsburg line had been concentrating power and bloodlines for generations. Every arranged marriage pushed the dynasty closer to a genetic dead end. Charles's jaw, pronounced as it was, became not just a physical trait, but a political symbol. The cost of unity, the tax of empire paid in DNA. And then came the wear and tear. Charles suffered from chronic health issues throughout his life. Gout tormented him. His jaw worsened with age, causing dental pain and complicating eating to the point where he often had to mash his food. His appearance grew more rigid, his posture more hunched, his face more drawn. The empire endured, but the man behind it was breaking down. Eventually, in an act of rare introspection, Charles abdicated. He divided his empire between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip II. Then he retired to a monastery, not in disgrace, but in exhaustion. He spent his final years in religious study, solitude, and contemplation. And yet his face, that unforgettable profile, lived on in every coin, statue, and official portrait. It became a kind of prophecy. The Habsburg jaw wasn't going away. It was being passed down, sharpened, magnified, and ultimately tragically embodied in its most extreme form by the final king of that Spanish line. But before we reach that final collapse, we pass through another Habsburg, one who tried to soften the family features with court ritual, clever grooming, and a truly impressive beard. 19. Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, was a ruler born into a dynasty where faces could not lie, not because they told the truth, but because they repeated it, over and over. The same chin, the same protruding jaw, the same broad lower face, and always the same unspoken contract between painter and patron. Enhance the grandeur, diminish the grotesque. Leopold, born in 1640, wasn't supposed to be emperor. His elder brother was groomed for the job. But when death rearranged the order of inheritance, Leopold stepped into the imperial spotlight with a face and frame that had already been sculpted by centuries of genetic repetition. His Habsburg jaw, inherited, exaggerated, and unmissable, was not just a feature. It was a lineage laid bare, And yet he ruled for nearly 50 years. Through wars, sieges, and revolutions in thought and art, Leopold remained a stable, if physically unremarkable, monarch. He was described as intelligent, devout, soft-spoken, and awkward. Short, with a long torso, narrow shoulders, and a jaw so prominent it altered the mechanics of his speech. But where others might have retreated from visibility, Leopold adapted. He mastered the choreography of power. His portraits are textbook examples of imperial mitigation. Thick moustaches, full beards, and an ever-present solemnity serve to cloak the architecture of his face. The long, carefully combed hair frames his features like drapery. Every detail says divine authority, while avoiding the more awkward truth. The Habsburg line was reaching a kind of anatomical singularity. In court, his physical appearance was never mentioned openly, and never far from everyone's mind. His speech was slow and precise, possibly due to mechanical difficulty. Meals were formal, but often strained. He preferred solitude and music, composing sacred works and sponsoring composers as if to redirect attention from the body to the soul. But for all his physical limitations, Leopold was politically formidable. He resisted the Ottomans, held his empire through religious conflict, and strategically married off his children to reinforce Habsburg influence across Europe. He understood dynastic power the way a composer understands harmony, build repetition into resilience. Still, the jaw was passed on, and the family line was beginning to buckle under the weight of its own design. The portraits had to work harder, the rituals had to compensate more, and the illusion that the emperor's body was the empire's strength, that was beginning to crack, especially in Britain, where a very different kind of breakdown was unfolding, not in the bones, not in the face, but in the mind. And this time the cause would be debated long after the monarch had gone silent. 20. George III of Great Britain. When the king talks to trees, the court doesn't call it madness, not at first. George III was meant to be the stable one. His grandfather, George II, had been bristly and foreign. His father, Frederick, was charismatic but dead before the crown could land on his head. So George III became Britain's long-reigning anchor, the monarch who wore Englishness like a tailored coat, honest, frugal, Protestant, and native-born. But as the decades rolled on, so did the symptoms. The first major crisis struck in 1788. Without warning, George became incoherent. He spoke rapidly, frenetically, for hours at a time. His letters became disjointed. He repeated himself obsessively. His complexion flushed. His pupils dilated. Ministers panicked. Parliament froze. And the man who had once represented continuity began to unravel in public. The court scrambled. Doctors were called in, not discreetly. George was moved to Kew Palace, away from central London, where his behaviour could be managed, if not corrected. The physicians applied 18th century cures, cold baths, restraints, herbal tinctures, all designed more to subdue than to heal. But the deeper challenge wasn't medical, it was political. Because in monarchy, the sovereign's body is inseparable from the state. When that body becomes unstable, the constitutional order starts to stammer alongside it. Who governs when the king no longer governs himself? In George's case, the answer became Parliament, reluctantly. The Regency crisis of 1788–89 forced lawmakers to draft legislation to allow the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, to act in his father's name. But before the law passed, George seemed to recover. His language returned to normal. His behaviour stabilised. And so the court, Parliament and the nation collectively exhaled and decided to pretend nothing had happened. But the episodes returned, again and again. Some were short and recoverable. Others, like the devastating relapse in 1810, left him incapacitated for the rest of his life. From that point onward, he was kept out of public view entirely. He lived in a carefully curated bubble of seclusion and ritual, still technically the king, but no longer ruling in any meaningful way. His son acted as regent. The court kept up appearances. Theories abound to this day. Was it porphyria, bipolar disorder, arsenic exposure? The cause remains debated. What is certain is that the monarchy endured only by improvising around the silence. George became a ghost of himself, visible only in formal titles, coinage, and carefully filtered dispatches. But unlike some monarchs before him, George's fragility wasn't buried under portraits or lost in myth. It unfolded in full view, making his reign both a warning and a precedent. Because elsewhere in the world, a very different king, half a world away, would lose something even more fundamental than his grip on power. He would lose his sight. And yet, Sejong the Great of Korea would still reshape a civilization. 21. Sejong the Great. In the Western canon of monarchs, power is often measured in battles, borders, and bloodlines. In Korea, under King Sejong, it was measured in ink. His reign was a symphony of letters, reforms, and invention. A ruler who, despite losing his eyesight, never lost his vision. Sejong the Great, who ruled from 1418 to 1450 during the Joseon dynasty, is remembered as one of Korea's most enlightened monarchs. He's credited with creating Hangul, the Korean phonetic alphabet, and launching a renaissance in science, law, agriculture, and philosophy. He's a national icon, literally the great, and yet, by the latter half of his reign, he could barely see. Historians widely agree that Sejong suffered from progressive vision loss. The causes remain speculative. Some suggest complications from diabetes or a degenerative eye disease. Contemporary records describe his worsening eyesight with respectful ambiguity. He became increasingly dependent on close aides, limited public appearances, and delegated daily affairs to trusted scholars and ministers. But none of this prevented him from governing. Instead of brute force, Sejong leaned fully into cerebral statecraft. His court became an engine of reform and experimentation. Scientific devices were commissioned, legal codes were simplified, taxation was made more equitable. His most enduring legacy, the creation of Hangul, was designed specifically to empower commoners, giving them a written language far easier than the elitist Chinese characters that had dominated Korean bureaucracy. Was his blindness a limitation? In ritual terms, yes. In the highly choreographed ceremonial life of the Joseon court, a monarch was expected to participate visibly, to read edicts aloud, inspect troops, appear at seasonal festivals. Sejong's withdrawal from such events had to be explained delicately. He cited chronic illness, sensitivity to light, and fatigue. But the unspoken truth was simpler. He couldn't see. Rather than stage a charade, Sejong created a new style of governance. He built a cabinet of scholar officials who carried out his vision, literally. Every decree, every reform, every innovation was enacted not just in his name, but through his mind. His physical absence from court was softened by intellectual presence everywhere else. He died at 53, having changed Korea forever. The blind king who gave his people literacy. A ruler whose legacy was not written in military conquest, but carved into the very shape of the language they speak today. But while Sejong's condition was handled with quiet dignity, the same could not be said in another ancient court. In Tang, China, when the emperor suffered a stroke, the resulting power vacuum didn't lead to quiet governance. It led to a woman stepping in, slowly, deliberately, until she was effectively in charge. 22. Gaozong of Tang. In the grand imperial halls of Tang, China, illness didn't just threaten the throne, it rearranged it. Emperor Gaozong, who reigned from 649 to 683, began as a puppet, ascended as a compromise, and ruled as a man slowly losing control, not only of his court, but of his own body. Gaozong was never the most assertive of emperors. The third son of the legendary Taizong, he was elevated to the throne more by political circumstance than personal magnetism. His early reign was marked by deference to court ministers, to his own self-doubt, and increasingly to his consort Wu Zhao. She would later become Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule in her own name. But her rise began through the cracks in Gaozong's health. By the early 660s, Gaozong began suffering from a series of debilitating symptoms, widely understood today as the aftermath of a stroke. Sources mention headaches, dizziness, vision problems, and sudden physical weakness. Modern historians interpret these as clear signs of a cerebrovascular event. The stroke left him physically compromised and perhaps cognitively weakened as well. He began withdrawing from the burdens of state, but unlike other monarchs who passed their duties to regents or councils, Gaozong handed power over, slowly and then completely, to Empress Wu. What began as assistance became delegation, then domination. Wu reviewed memorials. She issued edicts. She held court from behind the throne. Meanwhile, the court maintained the fiction of the emperor's primacy. Gaozong still appeared at formal events, seated stiffly, often silent, always flanked by advisors. His body, weakened and visibly diminished, was used as a living symbol, a fragile thread connecting the present to the legacy of Taizong. But the decisions, the policies, the statecraft, those came from Wu. Rather than stage a coup, she orchestrated a transition. All she needed was a sick husband, a silent bureaucracy, and the art of ceremony. Gaozong, by most accounts, never truly recovered from his stroke. He lived for over a decade afterward, deteriorating slowly, increasingly peripheral in his own court. His legacy is often overshadowed by Wu's ascent, but his condition and the palace's delicate dance around it became the hinge between two political eras. Gaozong's body may have failed him, but it also cleared a path for one of the most radical shifts in imperial power China had ever seen. And if power can be transferred through disability, it can also be hidden behind it. In the Ottoman Empire, a prince born into chaos would later rule as sultan, but only between long, whispered rumors, tightly controlled outings, and a life lived mostly behind the lattice screens of seclusion. 23. Mustafa. When Mustafa I emerged from the shadows of the harem to take the Ottoman throne in 1617, many believed they were witnessing a placeholder, not a ruler. And in many ways, they were right. His reign, twice interrupted, twice restored, was less a story of leadership than of containment. For most of his life, Mustafa had been kept in the kayfes, the infamous cage, a secluded section of the Ottoman palace designed to preserve princes while preventing them from launching rebellions. But the kayfes did more than limit ambition. It distorted reality. Mustafa spent over a decade in near isolation before being declared sultan. No training in administration, no exposure to the empire's complexity, and, according to numerous sources, no firm grip on reality. Contemporary observers noted erratic behavior, sudden outbursts, disorganized speech, compulsive habits, and mood swings. Modern historians debate the diagnosis. Perhaps schizophrenia, perhaps trauma-induced psychological deterioration, but the symptoms were clear enough that even his supporters tread lightly around the truth. When Sultan Ahmed Fuz died young, the court faced a dilemma. His sons were too young to rule. The next male in line, Mustafa. It was a break with tradition, the first time in Ottoman history that a brother succeeded a brother instead of a father-son transition. But it was not a moment of triumph, it was a test of optics. Mustafa's brief first reign, 1617 to 1618, was carefully managed. The Grand Viziers made decisions in his name. Court ceremonies were orchestrated to limit his exposure. The public saw a sultan dressed in finery, seated on a throne, surrounded by deference, not a man confused, distracted, or in distress. But behind the scenes, the signs of instability became too visible. He fixated on irrelevant details. He issued contradictory orders. Eventually, he was quietly deposed, replaced by his young nephew, Osman II. But the empire couldn't keep its plans straight. After Osman's assassination in 1622, Mustafa was brought back. A second reign, this time even more controlled, even more desperate. Again, the Grand Viziers ruled. Again, Mustafa's behavior raised alarms. He reportedly wandered the palace halls at night, muttering, pulling at curtains, fixated on dead relatives. By 1623, the experiment was over. He was removed once more, this time permanently. His nephew Murad IV ascended, and Mustafa spent the rest of his life in enforced seclusion, treated with cautious respect, but granted no real agency. The story of Mustafa the Wus isn't one of cruelty or excess, but of a system so beholden to dynastic succession that it tried twice to make a ruler out of someone clearly unfit for the role. The Ottoman court's solution wasn't transparency, it was ritual, silence, and curated appearances. But as it turns out, Mustafa's successor wasn't much more stable. If Mustafa was broken by isolation, Ibrahim the would be unraveled by indulgence, hidden behind luxury, paranoia, and a palace desperate to project normalcy while managing a storm behind silk curtains. 24. Ibrahim I. There's a reason Ibrahim I is often remembered as Ibrahim the Mad, but that nickname, like most historical shorthand, obscures more than it reveals. It suggests chaos, volatility, and a break from reason. And while Ibrahim's behavior certainly alarmed the court, the real story lies in how his instability was managed, hidden, and reinterpreted through the delicate machinery of the Ottoman palace. Ibrahim, like Mustafa before him, was a child of the Caliphs. After his father Ahmed bin died, Ibrahim spent 20 years in near isolation, not imprisoned exactly, but kept in a gilded purgatory designed to prevent civil war. The unintended consequence? He emerged into power in 1640, emotionally fragile, socially underdeveloped, and mentally unstable. His early days on the throne were marked by fear, not of enemies, but of being murdered like his predecessors. He reportedly refused to take power until physically shown the corpse of his brother Murad IV. Once installed, the court tried to build a protective bubble around him. Grand viziers filtered information. Royal women, especially his mother Kuzum Sultan, served as mediators between the Sultan and reality. But that reality kept slipping. Reports from the time, many colored by political agendas, describe erratic decisions, obsessions, paranoia, and impulsive behavior. He lavished gifts on favorites, promoted unqualified men to high office, and became fixated on particular women in the harem. His court, alarmed, responded the only way it knew how: ritual, censorship, and ceremony. Ibrahim appeared in processions, greeted ambassadors, and reviewed troops, all through heavily curated moments that concealed what couldn't be corrected. But the facade couldn't hold forever. His instability worsened. He reportedly believed palace walls were whispering secrets. He made sweeping policy changes without counsel. The imperial treasury drained. Discontent swelled, not just in the palace, but among the janissaries and the ulama. Eventually, the machinery that had once protected him turned against him. In 1648, the court had seen enough. With the support of military and religious leaders, Ibrahim was deposed. He was briefly imprisoned and then quietly removed from the political stage altogether. His young son, Mehmed IV, was crowned in his place, another child monarch managed by regents, repeating the cycle. Ibrahim's story is not just about madness, it's about what a royal court will tolerate, conceal, and enable in the name of continuity. Even when the ruler no longer rules, the throne must remain occupied, even if it's by a man lost in his own palatial maze. And while Ibrahim's delusions were born in velvet chambers, the next ruler on our list fought an entirely different battle: addiction. For Jahangir of Mughal India, the problem wasn't isolation, it was excess. And the empire had to keep him standing upright, even as his vices pulled him under. 25. Jahangir. If the Mughal Empire had a favourite aesthetic, it was grandeur. Minarets rising into the sky, gardens blooming in impossible symmetry, courts gilded in peacock colours and Persian poetry. But behind the mirrored halls of Fatehpur Sikri and the precise lines of Mughal miniatures stood a man slipping quietly into personal disrepair. Jahangir, son of Akbar the Great and father of Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal, ruled India from 1605 to 1627. His name means conqueror of the world, but what he conquered most thoroughly was himself, slowly, methodically, and in full view of the court. By all accounts, Jahangir began his reign with competence and charisma. Educated, curious, and deeply invested in art and justice, he showed signs of promise. But there was an open secret in the palace, spoken in hushed tones and chronicled carefully in his own memoirs. Jahangir's dependency on wine and opium was not a private indulgence. It was a political liability, and a physical one. Unlike the mental illnesses or congenital deformities of other monarchs, Jahangir's condition was progressive and self-inflicted. His health declined as his consumption increased. His energy waned, his speech slurred, his attention drifted. He missed important meetings, delayed decisions, and delegated far beyond what was considered wise. For a man whose empire depended on decisive leadership, his gradual withdrawal posed real risks. The Mughal court responded as courts always do. It shielded, spun, and substituted. Royal physicians attempted to manage his symptoms. His wife, Nur Jahan, increasingly took on the role of de facto ruler, issuing edicts, managing the court, and even appearing in coins and imperial decrees. She was a formidable political force, and the arrangement worked for a time. But the fiction could not hold forever. Foreign envoys noted the emperor's absences, regional governors sensed weakness, court painters began to depict Jahangir with less vitality, more detachment, sometimes seated stiffly, gazing heavenward, already drifting away. The grandeur remained, but the man at the centre of it all was growing fainter. Jahangir's body, once robust, became fragile. Travel exhausted him. Public ceremonies had to be shortened or cancelled. On the rare occasions he appeared in person, his handlers took great care in his presentation. The imperial image, unshaken, serene, infallible, floated on, while the man beneath it was carried gently by a court desperate to maintain the illusion. He died in 1627, exhausted in body and blurred in legacy. His reign is remembered as one of transition between the towering figures of Akbar and Shah Jahan, but it is also a case study in royal decline disguised as continuity. And in another imperial court, far from the Mughal gardens of India, another monarch's body would begin to betray him, not through indulgence but through stroke. A powerful man brought low by paralysis, and a court forced to choose between concealment and collapse. 26. Menelik III of Ethiopia was a lion. At least, that's how his people saw him. A warrior king who defeated European imperial forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896 and became a symbol of African sovereignty. He expanded his empire, modernized infrastructure, introduced currency and railroads, and played European powers against each other like a seasoned chess master. He was a living paradox, a traditional monarch with modern ambitions, a Christian king in a continent carved by colonial greed, and, in the end, a disabled ruler held upright by sheer legend. Because in the final decade of his reign, Menelik suffered a series of strokes that gradually robbed him of speech, movement, and the ability to participate in governance. But the Ethiopian court, like every court before it, was not ready to declare the emperor unfit. The throne had to appear intact, even if the man occupying it was not. The first major stroke occurred in 1908. It left Menelik partially paralyzed on his right side and struggling to communicate. His speech became slow, his commands ambiguous. yet decrees continued to be issued in his name. Audiences were still granted, carefully managed, shortened, and supervised. Servants helped him walk, dress, sit. When necessary, he was carried. To outsiders, the empire projected strength. European newspapers printed sanitized versions of his condition. His ministers, advisors, and wife, Empress Tae-tu, maintained the ceremonial machinery with precision. Tae-tu herself took on a larger role, issuing orders and shaping policy behind the veil of her husband's sovereignty. But within Ethiopia, anxiety grew. Succession became a looming question. Factions formed. Regency was discussed, delayed, and finally established, all while the court continued to prop up the fiction of a ruling emperor. For 2 years after his final debilitating stroke in 1910, Menelik was alive but entirely incapacitated. He could no longer speak, walk unaided, or make decisions. Yet he remained emperor in title until his death in 1913. The throne room never went empty. Ceremonies continued, imperial symbols persisted, but behind the embroidered curtain stood a motionless man, and beside him a court terrified of the power vacuum that would follow. Menelik's legacy is one of brilliance clouded by tragedy. He outmaneuvered Europe, unified Ethiopia, and left behind a modernizing legacy. But the final chapter of his reign reveals the limits of the royal body and the extent to which a crown can rest on a silence no one is allowed to name. And in the modern era, long after the age of empires and lionized kings, another monarch would find his image carefully curated as his body slowly gave way. This time, not by war or stroke, but by a car crash and decades of carefully staged appearances. 27. Bhumibol Adulyadej, Rama IX of Thailand. In Thailand, the king is more than a sovereign. He is a symbol, a father figure, a near-sacred presence woven into the fabric of the nation. And no monarch embodied that symbolic role more fully or for longer than Bhumibol Adulyadej, also known as Rama IX. His reign, from 1946 to 2016, was the longest in Thai history and one of the longest of any monarch in the modern world. But behind the carefully cultivated image of serene wisdom and quiet resilience was a man whose body endured both visible and hidden trauma, painfully real conditions disguised by layers of pageantry, optics, and national reverence. It began with an accident. In 1948, while still a young man studying in Switzerland, Bhumibol was involved in a car crash that left him permanently blind in one eye and with significant facial injuries. The physical effects were long-lasting, but so too were the symbolic strategies developed to contain them. From that moment forward, Bhumibol's public image became one of delicate precision. His remaining eye was often photographed from flattering angles. Official portraits softened the asymmetry. Royal photographers developed an entire visual language around his gaze, his glasses, his thoughtful, downcast eyes. In the official archive, it is remarkably difficult to find an unflattering image of the king. That was no accident. But time and the burden of being a symbol weighed heavily. In the later decades of his reign, Bhumibol suffered from numerous chronic health issues, mobility problems, back pain, heart trouble, and complications from old age. By the early 2000s, he was frequently seen in a wheelchair, accompanied by aides, medical staff, and a retinue of royal handlers trained in discretion. And yet, the Thai court maintained an extraordinary discipline around his image. Public appearances were staged with meticulous care. Audiences were limited, and those permitted to see him in person often reported awe, not out of mere reverence, but out of surprise that the living symbol was in fact still alive. Even his mobility aids were transformed into extensions of his authority. His walking stick became part of his formal presentation. The wheelchair, when it appeared, was always surrounded by majesty, gilded halls, royal carpets, lines of saluting guards. Illness became invisible not by denial, but by saturation. The spectacle swallowed it. In Thailand, lèse-majesté laws made even discussing the king's health in anything but reverent tones a legal risk. Rumours were stifled, speculation silenced. In this environment, the king could appear eternal, a living artifact from another century, untouched by decline. But those closest to the throne knew the truth. The last years of his life were marked by frequent hospitalizations. He appeared rarely and spoke less. The nation waited in suspended animation, unwilling to admit the obvious, that the body beneath the symbol was failing. When he died in 2016, Thailand entered a year of mourning. But in many ways, the mourning had begun years earlier, when the king disappeared from view, and the rituals began to speak louder than the man himself. His portrait remains ubiquitous. His name still elicits silence, but the human fragility behind the myth was carefully masked for decades. And as with so many monarchs before him, the court had learned to edit reality just enough to preserve the fiction. But that fiction becomes harder to sustain when the monarch's intellectual limitations are apparent from the beginning. When the crown lands not on a brilliant reformer or a tragic invalid, but on a quiet, awkward man whose competence was in question from the moment he first appeared at court. In Russia, the throne once passed to such a man, and the country quietly handed the reins to someone else while pretending otherwise. 28. Fyodor the Faun of Russia. Fyodor was the last of the Rurik dynasty, but he is remembered not for ushering in the end of an era or for any dramatic fall. He is remembered, if at all, as the king who simply wasn't there. Crowned Tsar of Russia in 1584, Fyodor came to the throne after the death of his formidable father, Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. The contrast could not have been sharper. Ivan was fierce, strategic, and terrifying. Fyodor was mild, passive, and by most accounts intellectually limited. Descriptions of him from foreign envoys and Russian chroniclers paint a consistent picture: quiet, devout, and largely uninterested in governance. Today, we might say Fyodor had developmental or cognitive impairments. Then it was said he was simple-minded, prone to long silences, unusually pious behavior, and limited in his engagement with statecraft. He loved church bells, it was said, and could spend hours simply listening to them ring. But his crown was not decorative. His reign lasted 14 years, which raises the question, how did Russia manage? The answer, Boris Godunov. Boris, Fyodor's brother-in-law and closest advisor, gradually took control of the government. Officially, Boris was simply a counselor. Unofficially, he was Russia's actual ruler. He handled foreign policy, court intrigue, military campaigns, and administrative reform, all in Fyodor's name. It was a delicate fiction, performed with precision. The court staged ceremonies to display Fyodor's presence, while Boris signed the documents. Fyodor appeared at Easter and Christmas services, while Boris negotiated with Poland and Sweden. No public proclamation ever declared Fyodor unfit. No regency was announced. To admit that the Tsar could not govern was unthinkable. So instead, Russia lived in a kind of royal double exposure. Fyodor at the front of the icon, Boris behind the curtain. The result was eerie stability. For over a decade, the illusion held, but it couldn't last. Fyodor died in 1598 with no surviving heir, and the Rurik dynasty died with him. His death sparked a succession crisis, the time of troubles, and eventually the rise of the Romanovs. But in a way, the crisis had begun long before, when Russia accepted a symbolic monarch and refused to name a real one. Fyodor's reign wasn't a tragedy or a scandal. It was a slow, quiet management of reality, a ritual more than a rule, and the strategy would repeat again and again in courts across Europe, including in Sweden, where a king's mind unraveled in full view, and the court scrambled to build a wall between the man and the crown. 29. Erik the XII, King of Sweden. Sweden remembers Eric XIV as the king who wanted to be a Renaissance prince, but ended up as a cautionary tale. His reign, 1560 to 1568, began with grandeur. Crowned in a lavish ceremony, he styled himself not just King of Sweden, but of the Goths and Vandals. He wore Italian silks, hired foreign artists, and dabbled in astrology. Yet behind the painted veneer of humanism and self-assurance was a man fighting a very public war with his own mind. Eric was the eldest legitimate son of Gustav Vasa, the architect of modern Sweden. Groomed from childhood to rule, Eric had a sharp intelligence and a restless ambition. But almost from the moment he took the throne, cracks began to show. He suffered from intense mood swings, bouts of paranoia, and impulsive, erratic decision-making. He trusted, then distrusted his advisors, issued contradictory orders, and veered between charm and fury in a single conversation. Modern historians speculate that Eric may have suffered from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder or severe bipolarity. Contemporary sources, ambassadors' reports, court diaries, even Eric's own writings document episodes of grandiose delusions, suspiciousness, and violent outbursts. The most infamous incident occurred in 1567, when, in a paranoid rage, he personally killed several members of the Sture family, a powerful, noble clan he believed was conspiring against him. Even his closest allies were shocked. The Swedish court responded with a familiar playbook: containment and ceremony. Advisors tried to manage his exposure, isolate his rages, and present a composed image to the public. Official proclamations continued to flow in his name. Portraits depicted him as a solemn, stately monarch, seated upright in fur-trimmed robes, gaze fixed and serene. But behind palace doors, panic grew. Nobles feared his unpredictable temper. Even his marriage to the commoner Karin Månsdotter became a source of scandal and instability. By 1568, Eric's younger half-brothers, led by Duke John, staged a coup. Eric was deposed and imprisoned. For the next 8 years, he lived under increasingly harsh confinement, moving from castle to castle. His mental health deteriorated further. He died in 1577, probably poisoned, though the details remain murky. Eric the XIV's story is not unique in the annals of monarchy. It is a textbook case of a ruler whose inner life overwhelmed the outer apparatus of kingship and of a court that tried and failed to build a buffer between a sovereign's instability and a state's survival. And Sweden would see this story again, centuries later, when another king, charming, cultured, but severely unwell, required an entire regency and physician-regent to keep the crown from toppling. 30. Christian VII of Denmark-Norway. Christian VII, 1749 to 1808, is remembered less for what he did than for what was done around him. Crowned King of Denmark-Norway at just 17, Christian inherited one of Europe's most centralized and bureaucratically efficient monarchies. But like Eric XIV before him, he brought to the throne a mind at odds with its responsibilities. Even as a child, Christian showed signs of psychological fragility. He suffered from anxiety, social withdrawal, and erratic behavior. As king, these tendencies deepened into something unmistakably clinical. He exhibited tics, compulsive gestures, inappropriate laughter, and bouts of self-injury. Modern scholars diagnose him retrospectively with schizophrenia spectrum illness or severe mental illness complicated by trauma from his upbringing. Yet the machinery of Denmark's absolute monarchy required a king at its center, so the court improvised. Public appearances were scripted and brief. Ceremonial duties were simplified. Ambassadors were received by ministers rather than the monarch himself. In private, Christian was distracted, impulsive, and sometimes incoherent. In public, he was presented as calm, regal, and distant, a human emblem rather than an active ruler. Into this vacuum stepped two figures who defined his reign: his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, and his wife, Queen Caroline Matilda. Struensee became Christian's personal doctor and confidant, gradually assuming control over state affairs. Under his influence, the government embarked on a program of sweeping Enlightenment reforms, abolishing torture, liberalizing press laws, and modernizing administration, all in Christian's name. The king signed the decrees, but the ideas were Struensee's. For a brief period, this arrangement worked. Denmark was effectively ruled by its king's physician, with a young queen as his ally. But such an arrangement could not last. Court factions hostile to Struensee, scandalized by rumors of his closeness with Caroline Matilda, plotted his downfall. In 1772, Struensee was arrested and executed. The queen was exiled. Christian remained on the throne, but now more isolated and powerless than ever. The rest of his reign, another 36 years, unfolded as a strange pantomime. Christian still wore the crown. His name still headed decrees. But real power lay with a series of regents and ministers, most notably his half-brother Frederick. The king became a ceremonial presence, a living seal of legitimacy for policies he neither initiated nor understood. Christian VII's reign thus stands as a mirror of Eric XIV's, a reminder that even in the age of enlightened monarchy, the state could still depend on a sick man's silhouette while stripping him of all agency. And just as Sweden and Denmark had their managed monarchs, the Islamic world had its own, warriors and conquerors whose disabilities were reframed as mystique, even as their courts carefully choreographed every appearance. 31. Timur the Lame. If you're going to be remembered forever, you might as well make your limp legendary. Timur, or Tamerlane, as the West would eventually call him, wasn't just one of the most brutal conquerors of the medieval world. He was also one of the most physically impaired. And yet, from the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of Delhi, from the Black Sea to Baghdad, no monarch turned a physical limitation into a mythic calling card quite like him. Born in the 14th century in Transoxiana, near what is now Uzbekistan, Timur rose from the fragmented remnants of the Mongol Empire. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan, though the bloodline was conveniently thin. What he lacked in dynastic legitimacy, he made up for in strategic brilliance and ruthless ambition. But even before he became a kingmaker and empire shaper, Timur had something no royal lineage could give him: a limp. As the story goes, and with Timur, there's always a story. He was wounded in battle during his youth. The injury left him with a pronounced limp and limited use of his right arm. Some accounts suggest the damage came from arrow wounds. Others hint at earlier congenital causes or a severe infection. The truth, as with so much about Timur, remains ambiguous. What is clear is that he spent the rest of his life favoring one leg, dragging a foot, with his arm sometimes hanging motionless by his side. In another man, this might have been a source of ridicule. For Timur, it became a brand. His enemies called him Timur Ilenk, Timur the Lame. It was a jab, he kept it. And then he made sure everyone repeated it, because few things are more threatening than a man who owns his flaw and turns it into a title. And so began one of the most carefully orchestrated PR campaigns of medieval history. Timur's court made no effort to hide his impairment. In fact, it leaned into it. Chroniclers emphasized his limp, describing how he strode with difficulty but purpose. A man whose body refused to obey, but whose will refused to submit. Poets turned his gait into metaphor. He walked crookedly, but his destiny was straight. His injury was not erased from history. It was woven into his legend as a mark of divine selection. The lame conqueror, chosen not despite his scars, but because of them. His court rituals reflected this theatrical sensibility. Timur did not sit passively on a throne, nor did he avoid public ceremony. On the contrary, he appeared frequently and dramatically, flanked by soldiers, supported by attendants, often entering on horseback with elaborate procession. His armor was custom-fitted, his saddle adjusted, his gait accommodated. What the body lacked, the pageantry made up for. Even coins minted during his rule bore inscriptions invoking divine will and legitimacy, never referencing the limp, but never denying the man behind it. Miniature paintings from later centuries often portray him seated in grandeur or mid-stride, his posture slightly unbalanced, but his eyes commanding. In an era when kings were supposed to embody physical perfection as proof of divine favor, Timur flipped the script. His imperfection became the proof, but the myth didn't stop with domestic propaganda. Timur's limp became known across countless continents. In Europe, where his brutal sack of Delhi and later invasion of Ottoman territories made him both feared and exotic. The name Tamerlane conjured images of a mysterious, injured barbarian warrior. In Persia and the Islamic world, he was lionized as a conqueror whose body mirrored the chaos he tamed. In China, reports filtered back of a Central Asian overlord who limped across empires. The limp was no secret, and it didn't have to be. Timur didn't try to look like a god. He looked like a storm that had already passed through heaven and come back mangled but undefeated. In that sense, his disability was not hidden. It was reframed, managed not by disguise but by ritualized reinterpretation. But even Timur couldn't outrun the contradictions. His court, while promoting his legendary resilience, also relied on a tightly managed choreography. The warlord king was carefully staged in both domestic and foreign rituals. When he received ambassadors, he appeared surrounded by symbols of order, the Quran open beside him, genealogies on the wall, scribes at his feet. His infirmity, though visible, was backgrounded by the narrative of invincibility. And behind closed doors, it's hard to know. Chroniclers loyal to Timur made no mention of personal frustration, physical limitations, or the daily challenges of managing a dysfunctional limb. But they did note that he relied heavily on close attendance and preferred certain methods of travel. Some speculate that his campaigns, vast as they were, often paused for longer than necessary, possibly to allow his body time to recover from prolonged movement. These absences were spun as moments of divine contemplation or strategic planning. In truth, they may have been forced intermissions. None of this dented his image. Timur died in 1405, reportedly while planning a campaign against China. His empire, like many built on charisma and conquest, did not long survive him. But the image of Timur the Lame persisted, not as a figure of pity, but as a warning. His tomb bears the inscription, "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." The limp, long faded into bone, was now part of a prophecy. In Timur's story, we find a case unlike most others. Where many monarchs tried to hide their impairments or had them hidden by those around them, Timur did the opposite. He turned weakness into emblem. His court didn't have to erase the limp. They just had to make sure no one mistook it for vulnerability. But not every royal could recast illness as mystique. Some tried to hide their conditions entirely. Others were so good at managing them that we almost forgot they were suffering at all. And some, like a certain English king centuries earlier, ruled from behind a veil of quiet agony, carried not by horses or soldiers, but by sheer determination. And perhaps chronic abdominal pain. His name was Alfred, and he was not just great. He was, in many ways, quietly broken, and still one of the most revered rulers in English history. 32. Alfred the Great. He wasn't supposed to be king. He wasn't even second in line. Alfred, born in 849, was the youngest of 5 brothers, a prince in the turbulent, war-torn Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, where thrones passed not just by inheritance, but by attrition. Viking raids were routine. Crowns were handed off like shields, and yet, through accident, attrition, and something that looked suspiciously like divine persistence, Alfred became king, not just of Wessex, but of legend. They called him Alfred the Great, the only English monarch to bear that epithet. And for good reason. He rebuilt the legal system, reformed the military, and laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the Kingdom of England. He translated Latin texts into English. He brokered treaties with Viking warlords. He turned burhs, fortified towns, into a national defence system. He taught his people to read, reorganised the Royal Navy, and composed spiritual reflections between battles. And he did all of this, somehow, while suffering from a chronic, debilitating illness that scholars have spent centuries trying to identify, let alone understand. The written sources from the time, especially the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the hagiographic life of King Alfred by the Welsh monk Asa, don't name the condition directly, but they describe it vividly enough to leave modern historians with a short list of possibilities. Asa writes that Alfred was afflicted with an unknown disease, one that caused constant pain and returned with intense episodes of physical weakness, starting in his youth and worsening with age. It often struck at moments of extreme stress or emotion, most famously on his wedding day. Modern theories range from Crohn's disease to irritable bowel syndrome, from epilepsy to a psychosomatic condition brought on by stress. The most popular hypothesis is inflammatory bowel disease, a chronic, incurable illness characterized by intestinal inflammation, fatigue, and severe pain. Whatever it was, it made Alfred's reign a battle on two fronts, one against the invading Danes and another against his own body. But the genius of Alfred's court and the mystery of his legacy lies in how little we see of that struggle. There were no medieval press briefings, of course, but the chroniclers went out of their way to emphasize Alfred's intelligence, piety, and resilience, while almost entirely avoiding any detailed mention of his physical condition. Asa devotes pages to Alfred's religious devotion and intellectual curiosity, but his references to illness are veiled, almost apologetic. The word suffering appears frequently, but it's always tethered to spiritual growth, not medical diagnosis. And yet, between the lines, a different story emerges. Alfred would sometimes disappear from court life for days at a time. His military campaigns were interrupted by divine visions or periods of retreat, command. Decisions were made through proxies. Royal audiences were rescheduled. There are hints that Alfred frequently consulted his own personal physicians and herbalists, and that his chambers were built with unusually private quarters, accommodations that historians now believe were designed to allow for convalescence in secret. When he did appear in public, Alfred embodied the model of a Christian king, modest, learned, and sober. But behind that image was an elaborate effort to protect and preserve him. Ceremonies were shortened, processions were designed to avoid excessive travel. His garments, often depicted as simple robes rather than elaborate armor, may have been more necessity than affectation. He was rarely seen leading charges on the battlefield. That task fell to trusted commanders, especially after the 870s, when his condition reportedly worsened. Yet his strategic brilliance never flagged. He fortified towns, organized defensive networks, and used diplomacy to turn Viking invaders into uneasy allies, all without appearing weak. The paradox of Alfred's kingship is this: he ruled as if unshakable, while privately enduring pain that would have incapacitated lesser men. And the court helped him maintain that illusion. His illness wasn't a secret, but it was reframed, not as weakness, but as sanctity. Asa frequently compares Alfred's suffering to that of biblical figures, casting his affliction as a divine test, not a medical problem. The result was a portrait of kingship unlike any in Anglo-Saxon history, a ruler who was not physically imposing, but intellectually towering. Not a warrior king in the traditional sense, but a philosopher general, a lawgiver whose strength lay not in the body, but in the will. Yet even this image required careful maintenance. Alfred's early biographers emphasize his self-discipline, his avoidance of excessive food and drink, his obsession with timekeeping and prayer, habits that sound noble, but which may also reflect the regimented life of someone managing chronic illness. Pain requires routine. Unpredictability must be controlled. The king's famous use of candles to measure time, dividing his day into precise segments of prayer, study and rest, reads less like symbolism and more like survival. As he aged, Alfred's condition reportedly worsened. His final years were marked by increasing withdrawal from public life, with his son Edward taking on more military responsibility. But still, Alfred continued to write, to legislate, to guide. He died in 899, likely in his early 50s, a long life by the standards of the day, and an astonishing one given his physical limitations. His legacy was sealed not just by what he built, but by how thoroughly he hid what he endured. Unlike other monarchs whose conditions became public crises, whose courts had to scramble to cover for madness, seizures or disability, Alfred's suffering became part of the spiritual mystique. He was not disabled, he was divinely burdened. And in a world where kings were measured by the strength of their sword arm or the thunder of their voice, Alfred ruled quietly, intelligently, and in pain. But pain doesn't photograph, and history has a short memory for suffering that doesn't bleed into spectacle. And so, Alfred the Great became the man who saved England, the philosopher king, the just lawgiver, the candle counter, the saint in armour. But behind all of that, he was also something far more rare in the halls of monarchy. A chronically ill man who never let his court or his country see him falter. And with Alfred, we begin to see the shape of a tradition, the royal body, imperfect and vulnerable, hidden behind institutions and iconography. Monarchs had always been symbols, but now they were becoming vessels, carrying their conditions beneath layers of velvet, law and myth. That tradition would carry on across Europe and into modernity, but in the years after Alfred, one more figure would rise whose body betrayed him in plain sight, not quietly, not slowly, but all at once. And though he wore crowns, he often couldn't wear shoes. His name was Louis XVIII, and his reign would become a final, elegant case study in how far a court will go to make agony look like majesty. 33. Louis XVIII of France. To reign in exile is a humiliation. To return in triumph, barely able to walk, is a paradox. And Louis XVIII, the king who came back from the ashes of revolution, ruled not as a youthful restorer of monarchy, but as a man stitched together with ceremony and painkillers, draped in velvet and gout. Born in 1755, Louis Stanislas Xavier, later Louis XVIII, was the younger brother of Louis XVI, the monarch famously executed during the French Revolution. He spent over 2 decades in exile after the monarchy fell, moving from one sympathetic European court to another while France was consumed by republicanism, Napoleonic ambition, and war. But after Napoleon's first abdication in 1814, the Bourbons were restored, and Louis XVIII returned to Paris not as a conquering monarch, but as a placeholder of legitimacy, one carefully propped up both politically and physically. By the time he reclaimed the throne, Louis XVIII was nearing 60. He was obese, chronically ill, and in near constant pain from advanced gout, a condition that had progressively disfigured his feet and left him increasingly immobile. The disease had taken hold during his long years of exile and worsened under stress. When he finally returned to France, it wasn't on horseback like his predecessors. It was in a carriage, padded, enclosed, and elevated, where he could appear upright even when he was unable to stand. The court responded as courts always do. They adjusted the scenery. Louis's mobility limitations were quickly absorbed into the etiquette of Bourbon restoration. Royal apartments were redesigned with short walking distances in mind. Ceremonies were restructured so that the king could remain seated throughout. Thrones were fitted with high cushions and discreet footstools. Public appearances were rare, and when they occurred, they were tightly choreographed, with attendants helping him into place, then retreating from view before the public could register just how much assistance was required. Portraiture, as ever, played its part. Louis was depicted with calm dignity, seated regally or standing with a cane, his swelling joints and hobbled gait transformed into symbols of wisdom and gravitas. Artists softened the lines of his face, adjusted the angle of his feet, and obscured his swollen ankles beneath layers of ceremonial dress. The image projected was of a king restored by providence and stabilized by divine right, not of a man whose legs throbbed so severely he could barely walk across the hall without wincing. But inside the palace walls, the reality was harder to romanticize. His gout was so severe at times that his legs had to be wrapped in bandages soaked in soothing balms, and he required multiple aids just to navigate from bed to throne. Meals were adjusted to limit flare-ups, but the court cuisine, rich, indulgent, and politically symbolic, didn't make that easy. Nor did the stress of ruling a nation still haunted by revolution, divided by ideology, and watching him closely for any sign of physical or moral weakness. And that's where Louis XVIII's real problem lay. His body didn't match the moment. France had just emerged from the Napoleonic whirlwind, a period defined by speed, force, and mythic charisma. Napoleon was a man who had led armies across Europe, who had himself crowned emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral with barely concealed contempt for the Pope. Louis, by contrast, had to be lifted into chairs. The court made up for this contrast with layers of pageantry. If the king couldn't dazzle with physicality, he would overwhelm with ritual. The Bourbon Restoration became a theatre of continuity, of old forms reasserted, old banners re-raised, and royal presence restored by repetition. Louis didn't move well, but he existed, and in 1815, when Napoleon escaped Elba and reclaimed power for the infamous 100 Days, Louis fled once again, only to return a second time after Waterloo, more exhausted, more diminished, and more determined to remain immovable. In his later years, his condition deteriorated further. By the early 1820s, he was so physically incapacitated that he could scarcely stand unaided. His legs were visibly misshapen from years of gouty swelling and infection. At court, whispers circled, not about scandal or intrigue, but about whether the king could still make it to chapel unaided. Yet the monarchy endured, in part because the system around him was designed to compensate for his limitations. He was, in many ways, a living relic, a reminder of the Ancien Régime, reanimated to reassure France that monarchy had not perished, merely paused. His very fragility became part of the performance. His weakness was not denied, but reinterpreted as perseverance. The king suffers, the people are told, and still he rules. It was a version of sanctified endurance, not unlike Alfred's chronic illness repackaged as spiritual strength, except this time the pain wasn't hidden in poetic metaphor. It had to be hauled down corridors and into chambers on display. When Louis XVIII died in 1824, his funeral was a study in contradictions. The body was carried in elaborate procession, but behind the mourning and organ chords was an undeniable truth. The last decade of his life had been a reign of containment. His mind had remained alert, his political instincts occasionally shrewd, but his body, so carefully concealed, so thoroughly managed, had been a prison from which he ruled. His successor, Charles X, would inherit a throne far more fragile than it appeared, propped up not just by ceremony, but by collective denial. The denial that kings, even restored ones, could still be broken men. And with that, the final name on our list closes a chapter on a long, winding theme. The royal body, manipulated, mythologized, or outright hidden, has always been part of the machinery of power. From Tutankhamun's canes to Louis VIII's footstools, from Timur's limp to Sejong's blindness, the crown has often rested on heads and shoulders that bore far more than the public was ever allowed to see. But those bodies, twisted, scarred, unwell, were not flaws in the institution. They were the institution. They were the silent scaffolding of monarchy, propped up by ritual, narrative, and denial, all designed to transform the fragile into the divine. And in doing so, they tell us more about power than any battle or coronation ever could.